The wind hit the tent hard enough to bend the wooden stakes halfway into the frozen earth. Snow hissed through every tear in the canvas, while Clara Holt held her youngest son against her chest, trying to warm him with the last heat left in her own body. The little boy could not have been older than 4. His cheeks burned with fever, but his hands were turning pale blue beneath the wool blanket wrapped around him. Outside, somewhere beyond the storm, a horse screamed. Then came the sound Clara feared more than wolves. Boots, heavy boots crushing frozen mud. Her 2 older children looked toward the tent entrance at the same time. Jacob grabbed the rusted fireplace poker beside him, though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely lift it. A shadow stopped outside the canvas wall. Another joined it. Then another. The flap burst open so violently that snow exploded across the floor. Vernon Pike stepped inside first. Tall black coat, silver watch chain, snow resting on the shoulders of a man who had never known hunger a single day in his life. 2 armed riders stood behind him, grinning as cold wind tore through the tent. Clara immediately pulled the children behind her. "Please," she whispered before Vernon even spoke. "Please don't do this tonight." Vernon slowly looked around the tent like a man inspecting dead livestock. 1 broken lantern, 2 blankets, a pot with nothing inside it, 3 starving children staring at him with hollow eyes. His mouth curled slightly. "You had your warning, widow." Clara dropped to her knees on the frozen ground. "My boy's sick," she begged. "Just 1 night. By morning we'll be gone." Vernon removed his gloves finger by finger. "Your husband owed me money. He worked that mine until it killed him. He signed papers. You forged those papers." The air changed after that sentence. One of the riders laughed softly. Vernon stared at Clara for a long moment. Then he walked toward the small wooden crate beside the fire pit. Their last food, dried beans, half a loaf of bread, a little flour wrapped in cloth, without a word. Vernon kicked the crate over. Everything spilled into slush and ash. The youngest child started crying immediately. Clara lunged forward, trying to gather the food from the mud with trembling hands. Vernon leaned down close enough for her to smell whiskey on his breath. "You should have learned something after your husband died," he said quietly. "This mountain belongs to men who can keep it." Then he stood and sliced one of the main support ropes with a hunting knife. The tent sagged violently to one side. Snow poured through the opening. The children screamed. Vernon smiled faintly before stepping back into the storm. "Be gone before sunrise," he called out, "or next time I burn the whole thing." The riders laughed as they disappeared into the white darkness. For several seconds, Clara could hear nothing except the storm. Then Jacob suddenly shouted, "Mama!" The little boy in her arms had stopped moving. Clara grabbed his face with both hands. "No, no, no, no." His skin felt terrifyingly cold. She pulled him against her chest, rocking back and forth while snow buried the edges of the collapsing tent. There was nowhere left to go. No horse, no wagon, no food, no family willing to take them in. The town had already decided what happened to widows who could not pay debts. They disappeared quietly. The storm grew louder. The lantern flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the tent whole, and through that darkness came another sound. Slow footsteps, heavy, measured, not rushed by wind or cold. The children froze. A giant silhouette appeared beyond the torn canvas wall. Even before he entered, Clara knew this man was different from the others. The storm itself seemed smaller around him. The flap moved aside. A massive figure stepped into the tent carrying snow across broad shoulders, wrapped in animal hide and thick wool. He had a rifle across his back and a heavy beard streaked with ice. One scar crossed his jaw all the way into the collar of his coat. His eyes moved slowly across the tent. The overturned food, the shaking children, the feverish boy in Clara's arms. Then the ripped support rope. He understood everything immediately. Clara tightened her grip on the poker near her knee. The stranger looked frightening enough to be mistaken for death itself, but unlike Vernon Pike, he did not smile. He crouched slowly in front of the little boy. One giant, rough hand touched the child's forehead. The man's expression darkened. "He won't last the night here," he said. His voice sounded like gravel dragged across stone. Clara swallowed hard. "We'll leave by morning." The stranger ignored the answer. He removed the thick fur coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around the child without hesitation. The warmth made the boy whimper softly. One of the girls stared at the man with wide, terrified eyes. "Mister, are you gonna hurt us?" Something shifted inside his face then. Small, almost invisible. Pain. The man stood again, his head nearly brushing the sagging roof of the tent. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. He looked toward the storm for a long moment before speaking. "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but the stranger was already moving. He stepped back into the blizzard and returned moments later with a wagon pulled by 2 enormous draft horses. The animals snorted steam into the freezing air, while snow piled across their backs. The man grabbed the collapsed side of the tent and tore it loose with one pull, strong enough to snap frozen rope. Jacob stared at him in disbelief. The stranger lifted the feverish child into his arms carefully, almost gently, despite hands large enough to crush bone. "Get the blankets," he said. Clara hesitated. Every story she had ever heard about mountain men returned at once. Violent drifters, hunters who vanished into the woods for years, men driven mad by isolation. But then another gust of wind ripped through the tent, and her daughter began coughing violently from the cold. There was no choice left anymore, so Clara gathered the children and climbed into the wagon beside the stranger. The horses began pulling them into the mountains. The storm swallowed the camp behind them within minutes. No one spoke during the climb. The wagon wheels cracked through frozen snow, while dark pine trees leaned overhead like silent giants. Wind screamed through the mountain passes hard enough to shake the lantern hanging beside the wagon seat. The stranger held the reins with one hand, while the sick child slept against his chest beneath layers of fur. Even half frozen and exhausted, Clara noticed something strange. The little boy had stopped shaking, because for the first time in weeks, someone strong enough to protect them was finally there. Hours later, the wagon reached a narrow ridge high above the valley, and there, hidden deep among the trees beneath towering cliffs, Clara finally saw it. A cabin, smoke rising from the chimney into the black winter sky. The cabin looked as though it had been carved straight out of the mountain itself. Thick pine logs, blackened by years of snow and smoke, stood against the storm, while warm orange light flickered through frost-covered windows. Clara could barely remember the last time she had seen a real home from this close. The stranger climbed down from the wagon first. He carried the feverish boy inside without effort, while Clara hurried after him with the other children clinging to her coat. Warmth hit them the moment the door opened, not the weak warmth of dying coals inside a torn tent. Real heat, heavy heat rolling from a stone fireplace large enough to stand inside. The children stopped moving entirely. Jacob stared at the hanging lanterns overhead. The girls looked at shelves filled with jars of dried meat, beans, herbs, and flour. Food, more food than they had seen in months. The stranger placed the little boy carefully onto a bed near the fire before crossing the room without a word. He removed wet logs from beside the hearth and fed fresh wood into the flame, with calm, practiced movements. Only then did Clara realize how enormous he truly was. The cabin ceiling barely seemed tall enough for him. His shoulders blocked half the firelight when he moved, but there was nothing reckless in the way he handled things. Every motion was slow, controlled, like a man constantly afraid of breaking whatever he touched. He handed Clara a steaming cup. "Willow bark," he said, "for the fever." She accepted it carefully. "Thank you." He nodded once. "That room's warmer," he muttered, pointing toward the back of the cabin. "Children sleep there. No questions, no demands, no strange looks. Just shelter." The children nearly collapsed from exhaustion the moment blankets touched them. Within minutes, all three were asleep beneath heavy quilts, while wind hammered the cabin walls outside. Clara remained awake near the fire, watching him. The stranger sat at the far end of the room, sharpening a hunting knife beneath lantern light. His face stayed half hidden, beneath his beard and shadow. But scars crossed both hands and disappeared beneath his sleeves. Not old scars from accidents, knife scars, bullet scars, the kind earned by surviving violence. "You got a name?" Clara finally asked softly. The scraping stone paused. "Elias." "That all?" After a long silence, he answered. "Elias Boone." The name struck something in her memory immediately. Years ago, men in town whispered stories about an Elias Boone living high in the mountains. Some claimed he had fought raiders during the border wars. Others swore he once killed 3 men outside a mining camp with nothing but an axe handle. Most people believed he had gone insane after losing his family in a fire. Looking at him now, Clara could almost believe every story. Yet this same man had wrapped her child in his own coat. Elias stood and crossed the room toward the door. "I'll tend the horses. You haven't eaten. I'm not hungry." Then he stepped back into the storm. And before she could answer, Clara watched through the frosted window as he moved through snow, carrying water buckets in darkness without lantern light, like a man who knew these mountains better than his own face. And for reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt safer than she had in years. Morning came gray and bitter cold. The storm had buried half the cabin beneath snowdrifts. Clara woke to the smell of meat cooking. Jacob was already sitting at the table eating silently, while Elias worked near the stove. The little girls watched him carefully from behind their cups. The youngest boy still slept near the fire, though his fever had finally broken. "You cooked?" Clara asked quietly. Elias shrugged once. "Couldn't let the meat spoil." The answer almost sounded defensive, like kindness embarrassed him. Jacob looked toward Elias carefully. "Mr. Boone." Elias glanced up. "You really live up here all alone?" "Most days. Ain't you lonely?" Silence filled the cabin again. Even the fire seemed quieter. Finally, Elias answered without looking at the boy. "Mountains quieter than people." No one asked another question after that. Later that afternoon, Elias hitched the wagon again and headed toward town for medicine and supplies. Clara watched from his cabin doorway as the giant horses disappeared through falling snow. Something uneasy settled in her stomach. The mountains felt safer than town. That alone told her enough about the world. By sunset, Elias reached the settlement below the ridge. Every sound inside the saloon died the moment he stepped through the door. Cards stopped shuffling. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. Several men looked away immediately. Elias ignored them all and walked toward the counter. The bartender swallowed hard. "Haven't seen you in near 5 years." "Boone. Need medicine." The bartender hurried to gather supplies without another word. Then another voice drifted across the room. "Well now." Elias stopped moving instantly. Vernon Pike sat near the back table beside the fireplace. Boots crossed comfortably, while 2 deputies drank beside him. The rich mine owner smiled slowly. "Thought the mountain finally buried you." Elias said nothing. Vernon stood and approached with lazy confidence. "You hear about the widow yet?" he asked. "Sad thing. Winter's hard on weak blood." One deputy chuckled. Elias remained still as stone. Then Vernon's eyes narrowed slightly. "You always did have a weakness for strays." The room became dangerously quiet. "You know," Vernon continued softly. "Fire's a terrible thing. Takes everything fast." At that, something changed in Elias. Not outwardly, but every muscle in his body tightened beneath his coat. Clara's husband had once described certain men in the mines the same way before cave-ins. Still on the outside, collapsing underneath. Vernon leaned closer. "Heard your woman screamed all the way down the ridge that night." The glass in Elias's hand exploded. Whiskey and blood splashed across the wooden floor. Several men flinched backward immediately. Elias slowly looked at Vernon for the first time, and the hatred inside his eyes was so deep that even the deputies stopped smiling. For one terrible second, Clara's warning returned to Vernon's face. He had just reminded a wounded animal why it became dangerous, but Elias only dropped the shattered glass. "I came for medicine," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked out into the snow. The entire saloon remained silent long after the door closed behind him, because every man inside understood the same thing. Something buried in Elias Boone had just awakened again. And when dangerous men begin remembering old pain, mountains usually end up covered in blood. Snow fell for 3 straight days after Elias returned from town. The mountain disappeared beneath endless white, while the cabin settled into a strange rhythm that almost felt like peace. Almost. In the mornings, Elias split wood before sunrise, while Jacob followed him through snowdrifts carrying smaller logs with frozen red hands. The boy tried desperately to imitate the giant mountain man. Though the axe nearly outweighed him, Elias never laughed. He simply adjusted the boy's grip in silence and showed him again. Slowly, patiently. Inside the cabin, Clara repaired torn coats beside the fire, while the girls shelled beans into old iron bowls. The youngest boy followed Elias everywhere now, clinging to the back of his coat like a shadow. At first, Elias pretended not to notice, but Clara saw him slowing his steps so the child could keep up, saw him cutting smaller pieces of meat at dinner, saw him placing extra blankets over sleeping children before tending the fire alone each night. A dangerous man was becoming something else, and that frightened Clara almost more than the violence, because losing kindness hurt worse than never having it at all. One night, the wind howled so hard against the cabin walls that everyone woke at once. A storm unlike the others had arrived. The lantern flickered violently, while snow blasted against the windows thick enough to block all light outside. Then came the sound, a horse screaming somewhere beyond the trees. Elias stood immediately. Jacob grabbed his sleeve. "Don't go out there." But Elias was already reaching for his coat. Another scream echoed through the mountain darkness. Not a horse this time, a child. Clara's blood turned cold. Before anyone could stop him, Elias threw open the cabin door and vanished into the blizzard. The storm swallowed him instantly. Hours passed. The children fell asleep again one by one, near the fire, while Clara sat awake staring into darkness beyond the window. Then finally, a shape appeared outside. Elias stumbled through the snow, carrying Jacob across his shoulders. The boy's face was pale blue. Clara ran to them in horror. What happened? Elias nearly collapsed against the doorway. He followed tracks outside. He muttered through shaking breaths. Snow covered the ridge. Jacob had fallen through ice near the creek below the mountain. Elias had dug him out with bare hands during the storm. Both of them were half frozen. Clara pulled blankets around Jacob, while Elias sat heavily near the fire. Blood ran from cracked skin across both his hands where he had clawed through ice and stone. The girls stared silently at the wounds. "Mr. Boone saved me," Jacob whispered weakly. "I thought I was dead." Elias said nothing, but his hands would not stop trembling. That night, after the children finally slept, Clara approached him quietly beside the fire. "You could have died out there." Elias kept staring into the flames. Wouldn't be the first time. The answer chilled her more than the storm outside. Later, while Elias slept in the chair from exhaustion, Clara searched for clean cloth to wrap his bleeding hands. That was when she found the box beneath the floorboards. Old papers, a rusted silver badge, government seals, mining reports, and one name written again and again across nearly every page: Vernon Pike. Clara's breathing slowed. She unfolded another paper carefully. Witness statements, missing workers, hidden deaths inside the mines, bribes paid to local deputies. Then one final document stopped her cold. Federal Marshal Elias Boone. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the sleeping giant beside the fire. Not a drifter, not a madman hiding in the mountains. A lawman, one who had come dangerously close to exposing Vernon Pike years earlier. Near dawn, Elias woke and found the papers in Clara's hands. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, he took a slow breath. "I had a wife," he said quietly. The fire cracked between them, and a little girl. His eyes never left the flames. "I gathered enough evidence to put Pike and half the mining board in prison." His jaw tightened. "Night before I rode into town with it. Somebody nailed my cabin doors shut." Clara covered her mouth slowly. Elias looked down at his scarred hands. "I got out." A long silence followed. They didn't. Outside, wind moaned through the trees like distant voices. Clara finally understood why this man lived alone among the mountains. He had not survived the fire. Part of him had simply remained inside it. The next afternoon, trouble came climbing through the snow. Jacob spotted riders first, 6 horses moving through the trees below the ridge. Elias stepped onto the porch with rifle in hand long before they reached the cabin. At the center of the group rode Vernon Pike. Dark coat, clean gloves, smile colder than winter. "You've been busy." "Boone," Vernon called upward. "Harboring stolen property now." Clara stepped outside behind Elias, fury rising inside her chest. "You murdered my husband." Vernon barely looked at her. "Your husband signed his own death warrant when he started asking questions." Jacob stiffened beside the doorway. The girls clung to Clara's skirt. Vernon's men spread out slowly around the cabin, deputies among them. rifles visible beneath coats. You've got something belongs to me, Vernon continued. Papers, records. Hand them over, and maybe the widow keeps breathing. Elias slowly cocked his rifle. Every horse shifted nervously at the sound. You climb this mountain again, Elias said quietly. You better bring enough graves. The deputies exchanged uncertain looks. Even armed men feared Elias Boone. Vernon noticed, and hated it. You think you're still a lawman? Vernon sneered. Look at yourself. You're just an old animal hiding in the woods. For the first time, Elias smiled slightly, but there was nothing warm inside it. Animals survive winter better than men. The tension snapped tight enough to break. Then suddenly one rider shouted from the tree line. Movement below. Another horse approaching the ridge. Everyone turned. An older man emerged slowly through the falling snow, wrapped in torn furs, and carrying a leather satchel against his chest. Clara stared in disbelief. She recognized him from years earlier. Noah Mercer, one of the miners declared dead after the cave collapse. Vernon's face drained of color instantly. That's impossible, he whispered. Noah climbed down from his horse with shaking legs. You should have finished the job, he rasped. Then he opened the satchel. Ledgers, signed payments, witness records. Dozens of names tied directly to Vernon Pike and the mine killings. One to paper in particular made Clara's heart stop. Her husband's signature. Noah looked toward her slowly. Your man helped me escape the night Pike sent killers after us, he said. That's why they murdered him. Everything connected at once. The mine deaths, the fire, the forged debts, the threats. Vernon suddenly realized the same thing everyone else had. His empire was finished. So he reached for his gun. Chaos exploded across the mountain. Gunfire shattered the trees. Horses screamed. Deputies dove for cover, while Vernon's hired men opened fire toward the cabin. Elias grabbed Clara and the children, throwing them behind stacked timber beside the porch, before firing back with terrifying precision. One rider fell instantly from the saddle. Another spun into snow, clutching his shoulder. Smoke and snow mixed together beneath roaring gunfire, while Noah crawled desperately toward cover, protecting the satchel beneath his body. Then flames erupted beside the cabin wall. One of Vernon's men had thrown a lantern. Fire climbed the dry logs fast. The girls screamed. Clara tried reaching them, but bullets ripped through the porch railing inches from her head. Then Elias moved, not like a man, like an avalanche. He charged directly through gunfire toward Vernon Pike. Huge boots crushing snow, rifle discarded. Hatred carrying him forward harder than bullets could stop. Vernon fired once. The shot tore through Elias's shoulder. He kept coming. Fired again. Missed. Then Elias hit him with enough force to send both men crashing through burning timber beside the cliff edge. They slammed into the snow, grappling violently, while flames consumed the cabin behind them. Vernon clawed for the revolver buried beneath the snow. Elias caught his wrist. Bones cracked loudly. Vernon screamed. You should have died with them. Vernon shouted wildly. Elias struck him across the face hard enough to spray blood across the snow. My little girl was sleeping. Elias growled. For the first time since Clara met him, his voice truly sounded murderous. The two men struggled dangerously close to the cliff edge, where firelight flickered across the frozen drop below. Vernon suddenly slipped. Snow collapsed beneath him. His body slammed against the cliffside, while one hand desperately caught the edge. Elias stood above him, breathing hard through blood and smoke. Vernon looked up in terror. Please. The word barely escaped him. Below them waited darkness hundreds of feet deep. Elias stared down. Years of grief burned behind his eyes. His wife, his child, Clara's husband, dead miners, burned homes, broken families, all standing between them. Vernon's grip began slipping, and Elias did nothing. The mountain wind roared one final time. Then Vernon Pike disappeared into the abyss. His scream vanished long before it reached the bottom. Silence followed. Only crackling fire, only falling snow. Hours later, federal riders arrived after Noah's surviving contacts reached the next settlement. The evidence spread across tables by lantern light, while deputies were arrested one by one. By sunrise, Vernon Pike's empire no longer existed. Winter slowly loosened its grip after that. The burned side of this cabin was rebuilt stronger than before. Jacob helped Elias raise new beams. The girls painted wildflowers across the window frames. Once snow melted from the valley, and for the first time in years, laughter returned to the mountain. One evening, Clara stepped outside carrying fresh bread, while sunlight turned the peaks gold beyond the trees. Elias stood near the porch carving wood quietly. The youngest boy ran between them, holding a tiny hammer much too large for his hands. "Mr. Boone says we need a bigger table now," the child announced proudly. Clara smiled softly. "A bigger table." Elias shrugged. "House keeps filling up." She looked toward the cabin, toward the smoke rising peacefully into spring air, toward children chasing each other through grass, where snow once buried everything alive. Then back toward the giant mountain man, who had pulled them from darkness without asking anything in return. "You staying with us?" she asked quietly. Elias looked out across the mountains for a long moment. The same mountains where he had buried himself after losing everything. But they no longer felt empty now. Finally, he rested one rough hand against the cabin wall. "I think," he said softly. "I already did." That night, warm lantern light glowed through the windows, while wind moved gently through the pine trees outside. Inside the cabin sat a family that should never have survived winter. A widow, 3 children, and the broken mountain man, who finally found his way home again. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.